Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Björk Retrospective, where we cover one Miss Björk, her entire discography. Not a while ago, since we did skip out on a week, so we're a bit late this time. But we last on this series covered Björk's Volta, the very controversial and kind of a tipping point for her career in terms of critical reception. So we have now moved on this week to cover Biophilia, of course, joined by Jakob Sanchez, now our go-to for the every Björk record. So now we have arrived at a new era of the sound of Björk.
Yes, absolutely. And what an era it is. As Jake said, we are a week late on this, but I promise we'll make it worth it because Biophilia, weirdly enough, is one of the Björk albums I think I have the most to say about. Which maybe isn't that all that surprising if you know me that well, but this is a record that I've truly been on journeys with over the years, and I've basically felt just about every way you can feel about an album about Biophilia, and I've ended up in this place where I'm very pleased to be, where I unequivocally love it, but I can also understand finding it frustratingly oblique as well, because truly this is Björk diving head first into the utter depths of conceptual music. Like, she likes to approach each album cycle with a clear vision for what the music is going to represent, for what sort of ideas and themes and images that she wants to evoke, how that relates to where she's at in her life. And we've kind of talked about how Björk's creative impulse has driven her in these strange and sort of far-reaching directions with each album. And I think Biophilia, similarly maybe to something like Medulla, potentially, where you have this somewhat single-minded focus and this clear-headed, relatively minimalistic aesthetic that allows Björk to zero in on a particular idea, whether it be a sonic idea, whether it be a thematic idea, and explore it in ways that feel both incredibly intimate and also satisfyingly comprehensive. I think that's a great way of describing Medulla, and I think it's a great way of describing this album as well. And so it's a strange beast of an album. As Jake said, it arrived at a certain point in Björk's career where, in the view of a lot of people, not necessarily all people, I mean, she was still getting very positive critical reviews overall. But I think in the alternative music sphere, Björk had kind of veered a little bit into the wilderness too much for some people. And if you were one of the people that felt that way based on Volta and Medulla, then it seems unlikely that a record like Biophilia would win you back. However, if you are the kind of person like me who loves when Björk just kind of goes full tilt, leaning into her incredibly esoteric, weirdo shit, just like speaking from the perspective of anthropomorphized, cores of planets and evoking like inanimate objects and talking about her relationship with the world and with people around her like a viral infection. If that kind of shit seems like it would be up your alley, I mean, if you're a proper Björk fan, it probably is. This is like, in a lot of ways, the most kind of like, in the rabbit hole Björk album. Like, it's almost to the point where Björk can, if you're feeling less charitable, almost approach a kind of pretentious self-parody of herself in terms of how fast she goes with a lot of the way the music is constructed and with a lot of the way that the sounds come across on this record. So I predict, even though I know that the three of us are all to varying degrees pretty positive on this record, but I predict that maybe out there among our viewership or in general in Björk fans, it's maybe a little bit more divisive of a record. It does have only a 3.30 on Rate Your Music, so a website that tends to be pretty forgiving to Björk. It's a record that still, I think, a lot of people aren't able to get on board with. And I'd say one of the reasons for that as well is that maybe more so than any record of hers up to this point, it's one that kind of resists uh, revealing itself to you quickly. Like I said, that I've felt just about every way you can feel about this, and a lot of that is to do with the fact that it's a record that you kind of need to really live with and listen to a lot to kind of even begin to sort of pass what's going on, let alone figure out whether you think what Björk's doing here is insightful and genius and incredibly compositionally finessed, or just literally sounds that are just thrown with a devil may care attitude into the landscape. There's a real and genuine case to be made here that Björk, in getting so obsessed with things like creating new instruments and perfecting texture, gets so into the weeds with her ideas and vision here that potentially some of the negative reviews have made the case that she forgets about the songs in that process. And I think it is, bar maybe Medulla, although maybe even more so than that, one of her most abstract and avant-garde albums, to be sure. But I do believe there is a lot of method to the madness, and that the compositions here are really satisfying, especially the more that you kind of give yourself to them and the more attention you sort of pay to them. They're incredibly musically beautiful for the most part. And I don't feel that Björk compromises on her creative vision at all here. I don't want to ramble on too much, although I know I tend to do that at the beginning of these episodes, but I'll quickly go over the general sort of concept in the background of this record, because I think that's quite important to establish. And then I'll let you two sort of talk about your experiences with this thing as well, and what your feelings are on what Björk is trying to do here. So following the, what was kind of termed as Björk's kind of pop pivot with Volta, which was never really a pop pivot, but was definitely an attempt to broaden the palette and kind of catch up with the place and time that Björk was now at in 2007. Biophilia is kind of just Björk fully following her creative id into a place that's so conceptual that it becomes very difficult to even begin to interrogate the record without looking at that. So Biophilia is actually a multimedia project that is intended, I think, to explore the links between the natural world, musical concepts, and technology, essentially. It's a record that's heavily informed by the various environmental and financial crises that were happening in the late 2000s and early 2010s. And Björk, as a part of realizing this vision, rolled the album out with a series of apps that were actually released. There's actually one app for each song on this album, and they are kind of now, I believe, sort of housed together within one single mother app. But essentially what Björk did is she used it working with a team of creators, helped to make a series of apps that allowed the individual to sort of manipulate the songs themselves, sort of change the direction of the songs themselves based on, I guess, interacting with the theme of the song in some way. So like in the app for the virus song, you could potentially try and save a cell from being attacked by, the viral material. And in doing so, you kind of prevent the song from progressing, because that song is a bit like a sonic representation of a virus sort of taking over a host. There's apps like the Moon app, where the central melody in the song kind of is a representation of like different stages of the moon, essentially, and you get to kind of manipulate that melody. And there's the Thunderbolt app, where you can kind of create lightning and use the lightning creation device to create a musical arpeggio using electricity, which is related to the fact that the core part of that song is composed using a Tesla coil. You have the mutual core app where you get to kind of arrange the geological layers of a planet like an accordion to use like the mantle and the crust and the core to like as like musical instruments essentially. There's the hollow app where you have the kind of interior of a human body and you can manipulate different enzymes and DNA to like build a drum machine and like create a musical arrangement, like using the textures of the song. But to use the textures of the song, you have to use things that they represent, like different parts of the body or that thing. So each song on this record, there's 10 songs, and each song kind of represents one different aspect of the natural world and its relationship with either human beings or time or music. The inherent, what Björk sees as the inherent musicality of things like lightning and geology and the human body and all these kinds of things, the cycles of the moon, whatever. And then of course how technology can be used to sort of represent that, to represent interaction with that. Yeah, it's all very heady, it's all very Björk, it's all very, you can seriously go on a fucking rabbit hole just researching this album and like interrogating like what every creative decision in each of these songs means, because like this is the thing, it's an album that, like I said, is one of Björk's most avant-garde works in terms of like it sounds so freeform when you first listen to it, but like once you dig into it, every single sound is like very deliberately placed and arranged in like the most purposeful and intentful way. Even in the case of a song like Dark Matter, which is deliberately amusical and chaotic because it's representing like this unknown sort of form of substance of matter that human beings can't like perceive or understand. So it's represented musically by this, fucking miasma of dissonant sounds. Like everything has some kind of every musical decision has some kind of conceptual meaning, which can make Biophilia both incredibly exciting and like kind of fascinating as a project to explore, and also fucking exhausting if you're not in the mood for that as well. So yeah, it's a lot. It's really Björk going full Björk, and as a result, I think it makes it a really interesting album to talk about, but also a record that I think you definitely have to be well in the Björk bag and well in the bag of kind of conceptual avant-garde music to even like have really a chance with. But I don't know, maybe you guys disagree. I'm curious what you guys think, how long sort of you've had this record in your lives, and what it's like listening to this for you.
Guess the answer to your question is sort of yes and no for how deep you have to be in to enjoy it, just because I guess I first listened to this when I did my sort of Björk deep dive last year, and I found it pretty fascinating from the outset. I think a lot of what this album's reputation has, like, everything you said is definitely part and parcel of everyone's reaction to it, but I also think the rollout and the whole app thing is that what I can gather about when this album came out, the general tone in online spaces was this, it felt very gimmicky to people, and just the overall release being so strange is in itself sort of what held people at somewhat of a distance. So I think that maybe kind of put people off, even though it didn't really have anything to do with the music at all. And as somebody who is a little bit more unfamiliar, I guess, with how deeply, like, I have a cursory knowledge of what these songs are and what they're supposed to do symbolically, but I guess my perspective really comes more at it from just looking at it musically. I guess that they are definitely strange songs, but I also think that if you just sort of isolate how this is compared to Volta, I think this was a smart move on her part, just because of the way this album sounds when you compare it to the cluttered kind of cycling messiness of Volta. There is undeniably here a sparseness and a kind of clarity to the instrumental ideas here. Every single sort of instrumental choice exists within a very sort of tangible space. Like when you're listening to Biophilia, you're entirely and completely aware of every single isolated instrumental choice, because they don't really like intermingle when I listen to this. They seem to sort of exist in this very openly spacious mix. And just because Volta was so off-putting to so many people creatively, if you take it away from the fact that the release was weird, I think that if this had just been another Björk album that, you know, had a normal rollout and maybe that like wasn't so forwardly conceptual, I think this album's reputation would be a whole lot better, or at least not a whole lot better just because it is positive, but at least marginally better, just because all of these ideas still feel in keeping with where Björk was headed anyway. Like you can trace back ideas to her connecting herself, technology, nature, all of these things as far back as, well, post really, but I feel like the sort of homogenic is kind of the inception of a lot of the ideas here. But I feel like this is so in keeping with what Björk is and what she represents as an artist, that if all of these things weren't at the forefront of the sort of musical conversation, everyone would have interpreted it and understood it in the way that they would have all of other Björk's music. Is very strange to me, just because I'm very glad I got to approach this album from the perspective of somebody who had no baggage whatsoever with it, because I've basically firmly remained in place of being a pretty big fan of the record. So I'm in a unique position where I get to sort of look at everything as sort of a third party observer and just get to look at this purely musically divorced from the cultural conversation, which is very strange. Like I guess maybe there is something to the fact that like there is a lot of structurelessness to this album that maybe might be the most off-putting thing about it, but it's still not anything that's super far away from what she had done before in my eyes. So the reception to this one is a bit perplexing to me, even if it was a bit weird when it came out.
One thing I will say about this album is that I also am in Jake's perspective, which is that when I came to this album, I had zero idea really what it was going to be about. I also listened to all the Björk albums for the first time last year, and I had no context to this record. I didn't know what it was going to be about. All I knew is that the reception to it was semi-polarizing. When I was listening to it with a bunch of people on a server, it was also kind of, the reception was overall positive, but I could tell that this was maybe among the least favorite of people's favorite Björk albums. And I ended up really, really digging this. I disagree that it's a structureless album, though. I believe this album does bookend with like the same ideas from Moon to Solstice, with those same, I don't know if she's playing the same chords necessarily, but there's still that same kind of twinkling feeling from like is she playing a mandolin on Moon and on Solstice, or is somebody playing a mandolin?
So, very interesting. So Moon is played on the harp, but specifically by 4 different harpists, and they're doing these kind of alternating sequences that represent like lunar cycles. But in Solstice, Björk is actually, I think it's actually recorded live, this song, and it's one of multiple tracks on this record that is composed and performed primarily by an instrument that Björk had commissioned specifically for this album. And the instrument on this song is called a gravity harp, which is like a pendulum that plays like a harp-like sounds using sort of the manipulation of space and gravity. So it's like an instrument that specifically is played by physical forces more so than people. So that's the story there.
I fucking love that, honestly. Again, I don't know, like, were people calling that pretentious? I think that's exactly as unique as as you would expect and as you would want from a Björk album, inventing
Right?
instruments to try and get like certain tones to get in
Mm.
certain, chord structures. And I think, and I love that, like the way it kind of starts out with these harps on Moon and then concludes with it on Solstice, because I don't know, like to me, it feels like the beginning and the end of a lunar cycle,
Mm.
or like the birth of the earth or whatnot versus,
Mm.
solstice, snow. I believe this was solstice was written about like it was a Christmas poem. And
Mm.
so you kind of have that sort of like birth and winter death kind of concept that's going on, at least in my opinion. I adore the songwriting on Moon. I love the soundscapes on it too. It sounds like the twinklings of like a bright full moon.
Mm. Yeah, and I like the idea of like the arc of the sort of story of the universe or something. I mean, that's something that Björk explores very explicitly on Cosmogony, which is a song about like kind of creation myths. And
Yeah.
what's always like interesting and super Björky about all of these songs is like when Björk is exploring a celestial concept or something, she always kind of finds a way to find within it like a metaphorical representation of like some aspect of her life or of her the way that she interacts with the world or her place in the universe, essentially, or a sense of kind of communion she feels. And look, in terms of pretension, or I guess people feeling that what Björk here is doing is all style and no substance, like, inventing new instruments and stuff and doing all of these weird and wacky things. Like, I could understand that if it weren't for the fact that every, I guess, outre creative decision like is tied up within something that I think is meaningful and conceptually, has some sort of substance within the songs on the record and within the concept overall. Like all of these weird and wacky decisions that Björk makes about like instruments that she has commissioned or like textures and tones she uses are just a way of more intimately and directly evoking a particular sensation or process or thing in the natural world that she's going for. Like it's concept. It's just Björk's artistic vision. Like it's very par for the course for her. And again, the thing
I'm not saying that I think that the people who would label something like this pretentious are incredibly unadventurous, but I'm kind of like, let's just put everything. I just think that the things she's doing on this are thematically cool. Like I don't understand why this label of like trying to do this shit is like seen this, like, to me as somebody who like really enjoys digging into the sonic and lyrical elements of albums and how they intermingle, an artist going out of their way to do this, like, trying to do this like very stylistic and fascinating like new like textural stuff, like inventing instruments and all that. It's like, well, first of all, that's just kind of neat. Like, I don't know, that's just kind of a cool thing to do. If you're going to present me with something I haven't heard before, I'm happy about that. But it's also just kind of like to assert that there is no substance here feels like not seeing the forest for the trees. Like I feel like I'm not saying it's really a you problem, but it sounds like it's kind of a you problem if you think that.
Well, like also at the end of the day, these decisions are always in service of musical ideas. Like this is the thing I think that people forget, right? Is that the music on this record, like the melodies, the constructions, the compositions, the way that Björk uses her voice, all of this stuff is beautiful and very well arranged and gorgeous. Like there are certainly moments where it approaches sort of conventional melodic structure more often than other parts. I mean, you can definitely see why songs like Crystalline and Mutual Core, for instance, are like, the singles that most people, I think, remember when they think about this album cycle. But there's also songs on here as well that I think are some of Björk's most beautiful pieces. Well, first of all, I'll start off with my favorite song here, which I think is the most musically gorgeous thing here, and probably a top 10 Björk song, which is the song Virus. I mean, just for starters, like the melodic tonality of the song, the progression of it, Björk's voice, the way that she utilizes the sounds at the core of the song, which is actually, okay, so this is another interesting instrument that I get to talk about that Björk had made. So there's this particular instrument that is used to make the primary sounds on the song Crystalline and Virus, these kind of really bright, pretty sort of sounding tones. And the instrument that she had created is called a gamma list, and it is actually a hybrid of two other instruments, a gamelan, which is like an Indonesian percussive instrument that's played with mallets, and a celesta, which is like an upright piano that has like sort of metal plates inside of it that is also kind of thought of as like a bell piano. And so she kind of fused these two very different sort of percussive instruments and created this gorgeous new sound that she uses on both of these songs. And in Virus in particular, she uses that tone and that instrument to like simulate the sound, or like the idea of a virus kind of mutating and eventually sort of taking over its host. And that's what sort of happens throughout the song. As it progresses, those tones get more and more sort of frenetic and intense until eventually at the end of the song, they've taken it over completely. And also, it's not just this, outre and sort of funky audio representation of this biological process. Björk also, because she's a songwriter, uses it to kind of as a metaphorical explanation of love and relationships, and the extent to which, in relationships, you have to give up a certain part of yourself, surrender a certain part of yourself. Your partner has to surrender a certain part of themselves as well. That there's this kind of vulnerability, and also, as Björk sees it, a kind of submission as well, where you kind of allow yourself to be given over to the virus, essentially. And the way that she constructs this multi-layered metaphor and also still keeps it all within this soundscape of a gamma list evoking a viral infection is like, it's incredibly smart. It's incredibly satisfying. It's pure Björk through and through. It's the kind of thing, I think it's emblematic of everything this album does so well and so interestingly too. The way that Björk, in exploring aspects of the natural world and exploring like how, certain natural phenomenon have like inherently musical qualities, finds or unlocks certain truths about like human beings as well, and how intimately we are tied up within those natural processes too, how those natural processes operate in often very similar ways to how we operate in different aspects of our lives. So yeah, I love that shit. That shit's fucking awesome. The way that she uses like I think I'm not sure if it's pipe organs or some kind of like brass tone to evoke like the kind of hollows of the human body in the song Hollow as well, which I think is one of the more sort of abstract pieces here. The way that she kind of evokes generations of DNA and stuff, like there's no real way of me talking about it without sounding ridiculous, but she does that shit. Like every song has an idea or a musical representation like that, and it's super satisfying to unlock them.
To go back to Virus, this may just be a me thing, but did any of y'all catch the melody to Cocoon in that song? Like, it sounded a bit like, okay, because you have the song about like, like two people now feeling like, safe and extremely loved in this relationship, in this cocoon. And now it sounds like, okay, like now at this point in the relationship, now they're kind of feeding off of each other. So it's kind of, you have like this kind of like safe and loving song, but then later in the relationship, it becomes like very kind of toxic and now just kind of like feeding off of each other.
Yeah, I can totally see that now you say. I mean, it's very tempting to read like certain meta aspects into this, and then especially considering as we know where Björk goes next after this record. But I think, yeah, she's great at exploring different dynamics in terms of relationships between humans and either other humans or the world around them. And I mean, maybe biophilia, like if you want to see it as, I actually think now that I'm thinking about it, and I'm definitely kind of like reaching a bit here, that you can kind of see this as like a kind of companion album to Vespertine in a certain sense, where that record is about explicitly about like the intimacy of human relationships and like how, you know, human beings kind of feed off of and bounce off of each other and kind of exist in a sort of synchrony when they're connected to each other emotionally. And this is a sort of record about that idea, except in the natural world, like physical, organic processes and how they're all sort of like connected and in a sort of symbiotic relationship, I guess. I don't know. There's definitely, now that you say that, and I hadn't thought of this before, so that's awesome that that you said that. There's definitely like a similar sort of thing or like idea or tone to the way that Björk talks about relationships, whether it be between people or just, you know, forces, on this record and on a record like Vespertine.
One song I want to shout out on here, which is by far my favorite track on the album. I think the record's really consistent, but this is sort of the one time on it where it rises to the like these just otherworldly heights that I just completely fall in love with, and that's the song Cosmogony, which
Yes,
this song is like, this is probably like a top 10 or top, it's up there in terms of Björk songs for me. But this song is like so peculiar at like, it rises with these like harmonized vocals at the very beginning, and it's like really eerie. It's just like a and then it like does the same like towards the end in that kind of like final fourth of the song. But this is one of the few times where it feels like the album really dives deep into the sort of atmospheric side of her sound, whereas everything else on here is really focused on being kind of sparse. These like the vocal harmonies that sort of back Björk throughout the entire time really give this song a sense of kind of weight and presence that I really love. And I also just love the lyrics here, where it's like Björk is just sort of enamored with the beauty of the universe, and like you see it through her eyes, like the universe being born, like it's starting out as this like primordial black egg, as she puts it, and then it like breaks into this like more beautiful thing. And then she just, beautiful vocal performance from her. I feel like it's a tired thing to even say, like, oh, Björk's vocals sound good on this song. Yeah, no shit. But like here, backed with this sort of like choir of harmonies in the background, it's just an amazingly gorgeous point on the record for me. I never tire of this song. I love, like, it's a really simple, like, structural song, but it also kind of contains that sort of facet where like a lot of it is very plainly beautiful, but that sort of opening and that kind of descending arc that the vocals go in at the sort of very end of the song, like really kind of show you the sort of multifaceted beauty and simultaneous like horror of the cosmos. And I love that shit. That shit's awesome. This is like the peak of the record for me when it comes to interweaving the sort of the ideas of like the macro and micro themes of the record.
100%. Gorgeous, stunning song. Completely agree.
And then going into Dark Matter, great structural choice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Like the sort of birth of the universe and then the sort of chaos that follows it. Then one of my favorite songs that I want to shout out is Thunderbolt, which is the kind of like in the single position of this album at track number 2, and has this gorgeous arrangement. And again, I've kind of alluded to this earlier, the fact that the primary instrument used to play this is actually a Tesla coil, which is used to create a kind of electrical charge arpeggio. So it creates a sort of run of sounds.
It sounds like Philip Glass.
Yeah.
That's what it primarily reminds me of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's totally some influence from minimalism in general, like minimalist composers like Glass, and the tones are super him as well. And I love that shit. Like, it's especially, I watched, there's a great live concert film of her performing Biophilia and other songs from other records as well, directed by the great Peter Strickland. And I watched that last night, and the performance of Thunderbolt in particular, I thought that was a song that really came alive in a live setting. So yeah, super sick track. I also want to shout out a song from later in the record that I'm really fond of, because an amazing song compositionally, but also it's a moment where Björk kind of steps away from the, being specifically speaking from ostensibly the perspective of, forces or inanimate objects, to being like kind of quite intimately human. And that's on the song Sacrifice, where Björk kind of explores the organic nature of human relationships, and again, it's very much a continuation of the themes of Virus as well, but it's a slightly more positive spin on that song. Like she's like has this approach to describing intimacy that is very much like describing a chemical reaction or describing like some kind of physical process. But it's also a song that feels like deeply intimate and personalized in a certain sense as well, because it's describing in the second person this woman's experience of connecting or struggling to connect with her partner, and the sense with which their relationship is based around the sense of sacrifice. And it feels like, while it seems a bit of a reach to connect a song like Virus to Björk's real life relationships or whatever, Sacrifice, I think, is definitely a precursor to a lot of the themes that Björk would explore on Volnicura, the next record. Like, in fact, in a lot of ways, this song would kind of fit in on that album. At least lyrically, it has so much kinship with what we would get on Volnicura, but also there's a lot of stuff, sonically and sort of the overarching conceptual stuff here that firmly roots it in this album as well. And it's kind of an idea, like, again, the sequencing here is masterful, because we have these two songs about the nature of connection within the human body and Virus, and then sort of on a more sort of personalized level within Sacrifice. And then Björk takes that and then completely uses a very depersonalized and geological metaphor with Mutual Core, where she's talking about, again, like the layers of the earth and the way that they interact with each other, and the way that, like, tectonic plates crashing together, which cause earthquakes and can create mountains and stuff, can also be a way of describing the intensity of human relationships and emotional connections and outbursts and stuff. And I love the way that she kind of veers between this sort of moody pipe organ stuff that's going on, and then these extreme sort of like breakbeat-esque breakdowns at the chorus of the song, which are kind of representing, right, those kind of plates sort of crashing together. It's one of the songs that feels the most kind of like synesthetic to me, in the sense that it's one of the songs that's the most like visual when I'm listening to it. Like, I'm getting a clear like representation of like forms and shapes and processes and action and collision and stuff that's happening. It's a really sort of evocative song, and it's always been a favorite of mine on the record because of how like exciting and electric it all is.
It also goes to show too about how, in some ways, even though it's not one of my absolute personal favorite Björk records, what I've found is that in some ways it could be seen as like the centerpiece to her whole discography, like kind of like searching for the origin of human relationships, the origin of the earth, the origin of music. Even like Dark Matter does not even have a time signature. It's in some ways it's the most like Medulla, because it's just singing in its most primal form. Like, even though yes, there is a synth behind it, but that's the vibe I get from a song like that. But even then, it just like, it feels like the entire thesis of the album and the thesis of Björk as an artist is to show how much nature, humanity, and music are all deeply, deeply intertwined with one another, and without one, the other cannot exist.
Yeah.
At least that's what I got out of this record, and where it kind of fits into her whole discography as well. And so hearing a song like Mutual Core, like connecting the people of the earth to natural disasters, to tectonic plates shifting. It shows how humanity is as much of a part of the earth. And because there are songs on here that are about I would say climate change as well. Like Virus can be read as man's relationship to earth or whatnot. And so I think of that as with humanity on the earth as well, the earth is also changing at a rapid pace as well. And that's also what I get from this record as a whole.
Yeah, I like what you mentioned about some of the weirdo or the more unusual sort of time signatures on this record, because it speaks to an aspect of the composition that makes it so it can make it difficult to get into at first, but also if you're so inclined and sort of fascinated by musical construction, it can make it super, super interesting. Like listening to Moon, I was just trying to count the beats and try and figure out what the time signature was, and I absolutely could not figure it out. And I looked on Wikipedia and it's in 17/8. So that's 8 notes, and there's 17 8 notes in a bar, and you can, so it's there's just one little extra sound above and beyond what you might expect from a conventional bar. I'm not super musically literate, so I can't explain it particularly well, but that little descending melodic progression on the harps that you get in that song, it's so it's beautiful, and you kind of feel yourself attaching to it, but it's also it's difficult to pin down because it's not restricted to the conventional form of a progression that we would expect. It's too long, it has too many notes, it's too difficult it feels disorienting as a result of that because of how our brains are wired. And I like that aspect of it. Björk is immediately disorienting you at the very beginning of this record, but she's doing it with the sound that's incredibly pleasant and warm and kind of beautiful because it's so unadorned. So it's a beautiful little piece of typical Björk subversion in a sense, because she's lulling you into this record. She's seemingly welcoming you, but she's doing it with a sound that with a kind of progression that our brains are not necessarily inherently wired to understand intuitively. So that's typical fucking Björk, really. And I love that shit. To me, this is an album that's just endlessly creative, and I'm always, every time I listen to it, I'm always kind of discovering something new to appreciate about, whether it's how the whole music is put together, or whether it's about something that Björk is referring to in her lyricism, or the way that her lyricism complements the sounds. There's always something new to discover with Biophilia, and I feel like a lot of people who are kind of speed running the Björk discography, or just trying to hear everything Björk related, may not be prepared to or willing to necessarily kind of give this the space and time, sort of just place it deserves, like any of her records as well, because
it's a rewarding album.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just an album that has never stopped giving, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't think there's a song on here that I really dislike at all. It's just
no
way.
Everything here is like you said, it's just endlessly creative and rewarding. There's anytime I listen to this, there's always something new to discover. And even though it's one I don't normally come back to as much, every time I listen to it, there is always a new surprise or something to really grab me. And shout out one element of this record that I adore. It's the backing vocals and the choirs. Really, to me, that's on a song like Cosmogony, where it's really describing the birth of the universe or whatnot, or in Thunderbolt. That's to me what a lightning bolt sounds like in fucking musical form, is just this big monstrous choir, which I'm guessing is Björk layered over 5 times. But honestly, her voice alone is the voice of heavens. Oh, absolutely.
100%. I want to shout out the deluxe edition of this album, which has some bonus tracks that I think, if you're into the record, are worth checking out. It has a 7-minute version of Hollow, which I think is actually superior to the original. And again, I didn't really get to talk about that song much because it's kind of difficult to describe, but it is it's a song that I think deserves more love than I see it getting, and has these great kind of cavernous passages in it. It's a super interesting arrangement. There's also a version of Dark Matter with choir and organ that I recommend checking out. Just gives that sort of, you know, chaotic and uprooting song a kind of new sense of texture. And there's a bonus track called Natura that I really want to shout out and recommend, because this song is excellent. It has this really sort of bizarre and heavily electronic and synthesized, cluttered sort of soundscape. It has vocal contributions. Now, I wouldn't know this unless I looked it up, but it has vocal contributions from Tom York in some form on this track. But it's like it's processed so that it's just like a kind of atmospheric haze, kind of like what happened with Björk's voice on that one Medulla song, where you just can't tell it's a human voice anymore.
Oh yeah.
And there's also
cool.
Apparently Brian Chippendale, who's the drummer in Lightning Bolt, has a credit on this song as well. I don't know where, but like he just has this amazing ability to synthesize different or pull in different sort of collaborators. But this
Björk noise rock album when
well, actually that kind of brings me very neatly to another bit of extraneous stuff I was going to point out, which is the fact that there's one of the things that Björk kind of commissioned in association with this album, one of many things, is a remix series. And there was actually a series of releases of various remixes from various artists. Like, I think they were released as like EPs. And eventually Björk sort of compiled her favorite ones into a remix album called Bastards. Now, this is a fascinating, as far as remix albums go, they can be very hit or miss, and generally more miss than hit. They're just not typically a form that I'm very fond of. They tend to feel very jarring, and certainly this is, as a remix album, this record, which is called Bastards, is all over the place, but it does kind of cohere, I think, more than most remix albums I've heard. And there's some really interesting ones on here. Like there's a remix of Virus by Hudson Mohawk, the guy from Tonight, which turns it into this kind of like absolute banger. But specifically, I wanted to shout out, there's 2 remixes by Death Grips, of all bands, on this record, remixes of the songs Sacrifice and Thunderbolt. And so, I mean, we're talking about Björk noise rock album when, like, Björk get produced by Flatlander and Zach Hill when, like, come on, get these guys on
all my love to both Sacrifice and Thunderbolt. I really like those songs. I actually prefer the Death Grips remix of both because they just have an impact that's fucking insatiable. It's really awesome.
I mean, they're absolutely bug nutty, right? Like the Sacrifice remix actually has like this is so Death Grips. They sample their own song on the remix. They actually have samples of System Blower from the Money Store kind of weaved into that remix. And because I was like, I recognize the sample that they've used here.
It's like you can hear MC Ride like kind of atmospherically along the edge of the mix. It's really funny.
Yeah, and you've got like this very like Death Grips-esque sort of electronic percussion that's very Zach Hill. That's kind of and just the way the songs are chopped up, like so sick. Don't miss those remixes.
That drum is also a sample from a Death Grips song, Full Moon Death Classic.
Yeah, shit, yeah. So yeah, because this is quite early, like, and this was 2012, right? So this was early for Death Grips. And of course, as most fans, online music fans will know, they of course went on to, you know, record a whole album based around Björk samples. So this is kind of like interesting as a kind of like footnote to that, I suppose, or as a precursor, or I guess indication that Death Grips and Björk, as these 2 artists that exist on various kind of fringes within their particular spheres of music, are quite like enamored with each other in certain ways and take certain ideas from each other in certain ways as well. So that's interesting, and I think that is worth checking out as well. 100%. Anything else that either of you guys want to shout out or mention that you didn't get a chance to?
I'll shout out Solstice because I think that's actually probably the perfect closer to this record. Again, like back to that bookend thing, but I think it's actually just this really lovely poem, and the writer of that poem is Sion. He had helped write some of Björk's best songs, Isabel and Yoga, and I think he like helped co-write the lyrics to those two songs, but he was the one who wrote the poem to this, and I don't know. It's just that to me is I think one of the more underrated tracks on the record because it just I don't know. It's the perfect, beautiful sentiment to close this record on about how we live on this earth, and it's just I don't know. The earth is just beautiful in all of its ways. I guess I don't know. Just Sion says it best on the song, and also I believe he co-wrote The Northman, so that's a fun little fact.
Oh shit.
That is true. He did.
Oh wow, I didn't even know that. That's actually awesome. One more collaborator I will shout out as well. This is the last collaboration between Björk and the producer, electronic music extraordinaire, Mark Bell, who you may remember Björk has worked with as far back as Homogenic. He, I think, is, if you've ever seen the tag Mark Bell's version on certain songs on that record, he had a big hand in the production there, but also stayed as a collaborator on every single record up until and including this one. He helped on this record with the composition of Dark Matter. And I shout him out because in 2014, he tragically passed away at the age of 43 after surgery complications. So this is the last time they would collaborate. But he is a really important and interesting artist in his own right, a DJ, a producer, very heavily tied in with Warp Records. He produced the Depeche Mode album Exciter as well. He has a long and storied and important contribution to electronic music. He produced Selma songs in its entirety as well. So yeah, shout out to Mark Bell as well. We won't get to talk about him again. So a super important contributor to Björk's music all the way for the last several album cycles. And yeah, that basically brings us to the end of Biophilia. There's probably a bunch of different aspects of this record that we didn't get to talk about, although I do think this is probably already one of our most sort of esoteric and just sort of bizarre conversations, just because it's kind of hard to talk about this album and not get a little bit
if anything, it should inspire people to revisit this album and discover those secrets for themselves, because
Absolutely.
This is an album where I feel like that's integral to the enjoyment of the experience itself.
100%. And yeah, check out those remixes we mentioned. Check out the live film as well of Biophilia. It's on YouTube in 1080p. It's a great watch. She does versions of songs from Vespertine and Medulla on there as well that are worth checking out too. Sick shit. And yeah, amazing new installment in Björk's career, one that deserves to have a bit more shine put on it. I'm still waiting for the day where it gets kind of thoroughly reevaluated, because it feels to me like a record that's destined for that, just because of how much meat there is here and how little people talk about it.
The fact that Volnicura seems to be an album that people have really, really put up there with her best stuff makes me like, all right, guys, one more.
Well, yeah, I guess I was planning on talking about this more in Volnicura, but I'll kind of just mention it now. Björk has kind of talked about how frustrated she feels with the fact that she tends to get better reception as a female artist when she talks about like intimately personal things and pain, than when she explores like stuff that's maybe less associated with, you know, inherently feminine interests stereotypically. So
I won't lie, I kind of find that frustrating myself as a fan of a lot of the albums where she is a little bit more expressive and dynamic. And not to say that albums like Volnicura aren't great, they are.
Yeah.
But as the resident Utopia enjoyer, I'm also just kind of like,
yeah,
damn it.
Sometimes Björk just wants to be like an entire landscape. That's
let a bitch be happy.
Yeah.
fuck.
Therapy is good. Yes, it's very good.
Let a woman be a place as opposed to a person if she wants to be that. Let her be a thunderbolt. And this is Björk being a thunderbolt. So let's do our favorite tracks and ratings then for Björk's Biophilia. Jake, why don't you go first?
Favorite track on here's gotta be Cosmogony. Second favorite track, I gotta co-sign probably the most universally praised track on here that we've done is Thunderbolt. Just an endlessly creative, really cool song. And I'll also say I also really like the closer Solstice. It's a really great end to the album. Least favorite track, while I would consider this album to be pretty firmly on the, at least on the slighter end of like the mid-tier Björk records for me, this is an album where I don't really think it has a worst track, just because nothing on here is anything less than like, yeah, I think Cosmogony is like the real high point for me, and I don't really think the album quite reaches that point again, but it trades that for being really fucking consistent, and then all the other songs are just really fucking good. I don't really have a bad word to say about anything on here, so no least favorite track really, and I give the album an enthusiastic 7.5.
All righty. Jacob, why don't you go next?
My favorite track on here, I'm gonna echo Jake, it's Cosmogony. Second favorite is Solstice. And third favorite, I'm gonna have to say Dark Matter. My least favorite, I guess I'm gonna go Sacrifice, because I think hearing the remixes of that song like kind of not ruined the song. It's still a very good song. It's just I miss those drums in the Death Grips remix. 8 out of 10. This gets an 8 for me.
Nice. My three favorite tracks are Virus, followed by Crystalline, actually, which I didn't really talk much about, but it's just an awesome song in ways that we have described other songs as being, but this Crystalline all the same is just like fucking fantastic. And I'll put in third place. I will put Sacrifice in third place. That's probably been the biggest grower for me, but it's really hard to just pick three. Least favorite, probably Solstice if I had to pick one, but I do think it's a really beautiful end to the record and fitting. So I don't have anything against it, and I certainly wouldn't cut it. So yeah, this is an album that I am thrilled to say I think is a great record unequivocally, and it gets an 8 out of 10 from me. So that gives us an average of 7.8 for Björk's Biophilia. Let us know at home what Biophilia means to you, where it ends up in your ranking of the Björk records. Do you think it's underrated? Do you think we're overrating it? Do you think that it's all style, no substance? Whatever your perspective is, we want to hear from you in the comments below. So please get in touch. We love reading your comments. We love reading different perspectives on the Björk records, and we are loving it more and more as this sort of series heads towards its ending. We will be back in 2 weeks' time to review Volnicura, and we very much look forward to that. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel if you have not already. If you want to go above and beyond and support us further, you can hit the join button just for $1 a month and get yourself entitled to perks such as priority comment response, getting your own little emojis of our faces to use in your comments more meaningfully, potentially getting your name featured in the title crawl of every video on this channel, plus being able to recommend us the music to listen to and having your recommendation go to the top of our listening pile. Lots of perks there. We would love to have more people joining the team. We have lots of stuff lined up in the pipeline, and we cannot wait to share it with you all. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago. Apple, think different.